Hey everyone, welcome to Labor Studies. Hope you're all doing well, staying healthy. Hope your families are staying healthy. This is the lecture for immigration and labor. We're going to cover a lot of ground. For this week, you had the two chapters of the Avi Chomsky book. Professor Chomsky is at Salem State University and has a very famous father, Noam Chomsky, who's a linguist and a political writer and philosopher as well. So you might know that work if you've taken classes where you've read him. And we actually hosted Avi a few years ago when this book came out. So that was the only reading requirement for this week. A couple of reminders is that your assignment 2 is due Friday by the end of the day. You should make sure that you keep up with the discussion board postings, and every week you should aim to have those done by Friday night, and that will count towards your participation grade for the course. And then your virtual office hours, once again, will be Wednesday and Friday 2 to 4. And I went through in last week's slides how to access that, but essentially you just go to the left-hand column of your Blackboard, click on Blackboard Collaborate, and when it's 15 minutes before the session is supposed to begin, you can just enter the chat room, and then we can chat either publicly or privately. I think we can do it. Sorry, this is Shadow. Shadow is excited to help. You can we can either video chat or we can text chat, whatever's easiest for you. And as I said last week, I can look at drafts, but just know that as it gets closer to Friday, my capacity to turn those around to you in time for them my comments to be useful, is going to be limited. So definitely keep that in mind. Okay, so the three questions that I want to focus on for this lecture is one, what's the relationship between immigration and work in the United States? We tend to think of them as being very intimately connected because that's what we have come to expect over time, but there isn't necessarily a direct link between immigration status and work status, fundamentally, philosophically. The second question is Shadow's tail, how has that relationship changed during the last 150 years? And then the third question is one that we're going to think about for the discussion board, which is, who is it who's actually responsible for ensuring that a product or a service is done in a way that's fair and equitable? So I'll talk a little bit more about each one of those. Okay. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard this history before, either on field trips in K-12 or in other classes you've taken. If you've taken Professor Gonzalez or Professor Pinheiro Shields in the sociology department, or maybe Professor Forant in the history department, you're very familiar with the history of Lowell. But I think it's worth noting. So Lowell has always been a city of immigration. Really, Shadow? That's a lot. I'm just gonna move her. So Lowell has always been a city of immigration, and it has largely been tied to work in the city, at least in the early years. So whereas the mills were staffed with folks who had already been here, largely English and quote unquote American, so had been here for at least a few generations, farm girls who were coming to work in the mills. By the mid-19th century, we saw a huge influx of Irish immigrants into Lowell, which is connected to the famine that was happening in Ireland, and also French Canadians coming down. And so from the 1830s through the 1860s, we're seeing this huge influx of immigrants who are working largely in the mills in lower paid jobs. They're doing some organizing, and they are eventually leading to strikes, which we've talked about a little bit in the early 20th century. Towards the end of the century, we start seeing a number of other groups start, like a second wave of immigration starting to come through. So Jews from Russia, Portuguese folks, Greek immigrants, folks from Poland, Syria, Lebanon, Lithuania. So we're getting Middle Eastern and Eastern Europe and Russia. And at that point, once immigration communities get kind of established, then you have people who are coming for their family and for their community and getting the jobs that are here. By the 70s and 80s, we'll talk a little bit about the US foreign policy that brings a lot of refugees here. And we have obviously the Cambodian community that makes up such a large, vibrant part of Lowell today. And then we have another more recent wave of immigration in the 21st century. So Brazil, West Africa and Congo, India, Iraq, Burma, and those are both kind of regular, what we would call regular immigrants. They are refugees and they're under TPS, which is temporary protected status. And we'll talk more about each of those categories in a few minutes. So Lowell has always been a city that from its very founding, where waves of immigrants are coming through, becoming naturalized, starting their own communities, and I will post some resources as well if you want to read more about that. Okay, so I'm going to take us on a whirlwind history of US immigration policy. It's very, very short. It leaves a lot of stuff out, but it has an eye to labor, and I think it's useful for some of the context for the reading that you did for this week. So first, it's important to just note that you know, when we say the United States is a country of immigrants, obviously that's leaving out indigenous people who were here and who were actually forced to migrate, forced out of US settler territories, and as well, of course, as enslaved peoples, mostly peoples of African descent, who were excluded from citizenship until at least 1870 on paper, and in practice, excluded from the rights of citizenship much further after that. Also important to know is that for the most part, Asian laborers are banned from legal immigration into the country beginning in 1875, and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 is an important part of that. In the 1890s, for the first time, we start to see a federal law that overwrites immigration policy that applies to everybody. Up until the 1890s, it was really, for the most part, kind of up to the states to enforce what rights were given to people, who was allowed in and who wasn't. I think that I've mentioned in class, I lived in Oregon for several years before I moved to the East Coast, and I did not know until I moved there, they certainly didn't teach us in school. Oregon, for example, was established really as a white separatist state in the 19th century, specifically to exclude immigrants from being able to cross the border into the state. So that history is very much with us. It's very much shaped the way that our country looks and operates and who lives where. So in the 1890s, we start to see laws for the first time that say who is allowed to come in as an immigrant and who is not. We have the first national inspection station at Ellis Island that was really screening people for health conditions more than anything else. And we have the first public charge laws. So these are laws that say you can't immigrate if you're going to rely on the state or charity in order to survive. So you have to, and this ties into our kind of national myth of having, like, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and this sort of rugged individualism. So you have to be able to provide for yourself and live on your own without having any kind of support from any state entity or charity entity. And for the first time, if you immigrate into the country and you you do become what's called a public charge, and this is obviously still very much in the news right now, since our president has introduced increased standards for public charge once again into our immigration law. If it does become known that you are a public charge, you can actually be deported. And at first that was within just 1 year of arrival, and then eventually within 5 years, which is a pretty strict standard. If you think about actual 5 years you have to live here without requiring, you know, these programs weren't available at the time, but food stamps or any kind of other charity or public programs. There are also prohibited groups. So for example, the Chinese Exclusion Act, who would not have been able to access, and I don't know if it's in the chapter that you read or another one, but Avi Chomsky makes the point that actually these laws in the 1890s are really governing people who arrive by sea. I believe this is not in the chapter that you read, but so who does that exclude? If you think about who's coming over by sea, we're talking about Europeans mainly. Who's not coming by sea would be folks coming from Mexico, and there's a reason for that, which we'll talk about in a second. Okay. So as we move kind of into the 20s, post-war, now we have an updated system that has certain quotas for different European countries. So the number is not the same, and it is configured in such a way that it incentivizes immigration from wealthier countries that were considered white, so England, Scandinavia, and de-incentivizes immigration from Ireland and Italy. For the first time in the 20s, entering without inspection actually becomes a crime. So in the way that we talk about illegal immigration today, there really wasn't illegal immigration at the time that most of your great-grandparents, my grandparents' generation, were coming over. You know, so all of my grandparents, for example, were here by this time, and some of you did some really interesting work on this in your first assignment papers. And in the 20s, for the first time, we actually have a border patrol that's created. Now, I know that we talked about the Bracero program before, but I'm just going to emphasize it again because it is an important part of the Chomsky reading that you did for today. So the program is a joint effort by the US and Mexican governments. It ran from 1942 to 1965. It allows for Mexican migrants to come across the border and work legally in the US for 1 season or for more. And so there is a system set up, and it's largely reliant on agricultural labor. At the same time, there is another side of this system where if you don't have guarantee that you are working and that the government and your employer have given you the okay to come over via the Bracero program, then you are termed illegal and you are subject to deportation. And there are mass deportations throughout the 50s, really up until and continuing after the Bracero program ended. So the thing about the Braceros is that they had some workers' rights. In theory, they were guaranteed wages equal to whatever the US-born workers who were working there were getting, and they were guaranteed housing and living costs. In practice, essentially, there was so much labor coming on the undocumented side, so there was created a market for this labor. The Bracero program was established in order to fulfill labor shortages because of World War II. And in doing so, a system was created where there was a market for this lower paid, you know, in theory they have rights, but in practice that, you know, it was very difficult to make sure that those rights were being followed, and you could still get illegal laborers and pay them barely anything. And so an entire system was created whereby more and more folks were coming really seasonally, and then going, you know, coming north as the seasons progress, going back south as it gets colder. Um, and by 1965, the US and Mexico formally end that program because of the fact that, there were so many folks who, well, because of a few reasons, but in part because there are already so many people who are coming illegally that very few people are coming over through this program anymore. We're going to come back to that in a second. Just to note that starting in the 1970s largely, we also start to see a lot of resettlement of refugees who are able to work legally from Cuba, from Vietnam, Cambodia, and a number of other countries. And just as a side note to say that this is largely, most of this refugee resettlement is created by US intervention in other countries, military intervention in other countries. In the original version of the syllabus, we were going to look a little bit more into some of that military intervention and some of the ways that US labor, the labor movement, has been supportive of that, and has much smaller kind of anti-war strands, especially starting in the 60s and 70s, moving forward. But if you think about what we've talked about earlier, the fact that the US labor movement largely moved into its modern era at the end of World War II, when we have a lot of folks coming back into the labor force, and there is kind of increased prosperity and an agreement, at least among white, largely white, some African American labor unions, that there would be peace moving forward. And we do see increasing integration of white and Black workers moving forward. Okay. So this is a little small. Hopefully you can see this. Immigration, very briefly, up to the present day. In 65, there was a switch as the Bracero program is ending. Mexico became kind of formally integrated into the immigration program. Prior to that, it was really just the Bracero program, and it was considered separate. So we talked about the fact that, if you move by ship, then you go through Ellis Island and you have this inspection. And Mexican labor was considered separate to that. Part of that is because the border has actually been shifting, right? If you know your United States history, and part of that is that there was a reliance on that Mexican labor, so it was sort of carved out in a way. If you speed up to the 80s, the first kind of modern immigration reform is called IRCA, IRCA, the Immigration Reform and Control Act. It granted amnesty to a large number of people who had been in the US illegally, quote unquote, and if they had been here and working for long enough, they could apply to regularize and become naturalized citizens. It also, for the first time, is when we see penalties for employers who are hiring people who don't have documentation. Those penalties are very minor. They're considered just a slap on the wrist. It's a little bit like the way that we talked about the anti-union penalties. If an employer breaks the law and does something to suppress union activity, there really isn't very much of a penalty. It's very minor. It's sort of similar with employers who are hiring workers who are undocumented. By 1990, we have the kind of modern categories of immigration that we still use today, and I'll come back to those in a second, but there are hard caps put on the number of immigrants who are allowed in, and there's a preference system put in place. So if you're a highly skilled worker, you're at the top of that preference list, and there are other categories. In the mid-90s, I think that we were going to read about NAFTA this week, and I decided to just cut it in the interest of we're all still getting used to social distancing and working from home and being online. So hopefully we'll be able to circle back around to NAFTA, maybe when we read the Fashionopolis book. Suffice to say that there is a free trade agreement that highly incentivizes U.S. industry to move out of the country and into Mexico, where working conditions, labor laws, and environmental laws make it much easier for employers to operate much more cheaply. So that does play a factor here. By close to the turn of the century, we have what's called the E-Verify system, and that becomes more and more widespread. And that basically means that when you hire an immigrant, particularly at the federal level, though a lot of states, most states I think now opt into E-Verify as well, you have to be checked against a database that the federal government maintains. And if you have been found to have come in without authorization and attempted to work in the past, you will not have the right to work, basically, to make a very complicated process very short. Obama era, we have DACA, which is deferred action for children who were brought here at a very young age, and for their parents, DAPA. And we know that that has been rolled back now. And I think for the purposes of our conversation, we'll stop there. We're going to come back again when we talk about the fashion industry as our kind of big case study. We'll talk about some of the Trump era immigration policies and what the impacts of that have been. Okay, so just really briefly, which this hopefully will help you if there are moments where Chomsky is talking about these different visa categories. Many immigrants come in on visas that are attached to their family status. So if you marry an American citizen, or if you have a child here, that child is a citizen, and the child can eventually petition to have family members become naturalized. But a lot of folks are brought here on temporary work visas, and this is really the modern day legacy of the Bracero program in some ways. So the first of these is the H-1B program. A lot of university workers are on H-1B visas, and these are specialized occupations, people who have advanced degrees, mostly PhDs, folks who are either going to work in academia, they're going to work on research, or a lot of folks in the Department of Defense are brought in on H-1Bs. And that is about 65,000 people every year, and that can grow up to 85,000 in any given year. H-2A is really sort of the closest equivalent to the Braceros. So these are agriculture workers, specifically they're carved out. It's a seasonal pass kind of that's valid for up to 1 year, but you can keep renewing it for up to 4 years. There's no cap on the number of ag workers that we can bring in on these kinds of visas. So that's something that's interesting to think about. So last year, we had 242,000 workers coming in seasonally to pick produce or process it, and then to leave again for the rest of the year. And then we have H-2B. So these are temporary workers as well, other kinds of seasonal work, anything that's not in the agricultural sector, and that's much smaller as well. So that's set at 66,000 a year. And then we also have what's called temporary protected status. So if you look at these temporary work visas, these are visas that are specifically tied to the work that you're going to do while you're here. The purpose of coming to the US for you is to perform some kind of labor. Obviously, family or tourist visas aren't directly tied to labor, but I think that in our national conversation, so much of the way that we talk about immigration is tied to labor. Are folks going to steal jobs from US citizens? Are they able to take care of themselves while they're here, etc.? So the other piece that I want to mention is called temporary protected status. This came in 1990, and it basically says that any country that experiences a natural disaster, a civil war, famine, some other kind of like mass emergency, it has a temporary agreement with the government, and it has to be like the government, the federal government decides what countries have TPS and for how long. So this past year, there's been a lot of anxiety because Trump has said that he's going to be ending TPS for certain groups and then given it a reprieve, and it's kind of up in the air right now. But these are folks who are never going to be eligible to apply for citizenship. So we have plenty of folks here in Massachusetts who, for example, came from El Salvador during the Civil War, have been here even since before 1990, but are included under the TPS umbrella, have been here, 30, 35 years, and they're never going to be eligible for citizenship because they're under this umbrella of TPS. And they're basically here at the kind of pleasure of the US government. So any president can come in and issue a decree that says, you know what, El Salvador, which happened this past year, you all should be able to go back to your own country because the conditions have improved. Now, if you think about what that means, you've been here for 30 years, you've had children here, you have a job here, there aren't restrictions on being able to work when you're on TPS, but suddenly you have to, if your TPS agreement ends, you would have to go back home to a country where maybe your children don't speak the language, maybe you've, you don't have the kind of connections and community. You have to kind of pick up and leave everything behind. So the countries that currently have TPS rights in the US are El Salvador, Haiti, Honduras, which have been the kind of long-term TPS countries, and have been here the longest and have the largest numbers of folks. More recently, Yemen, Syria, Nepal, Sudan, Nicaragua, and Somalia. Okay. So I want to highlight a couple of things that Chomsky says about the kinds of industries that immigrants are largely hired into. So she says these are jobs that are largely dirty or very dangerous. They're working for very low wages, very few or no benefits. They're jobs that are difficult, but not at the same time that they're difficult physically, but they're not considered skilled labor. They're on seasonal or unstable schedules. They have very little job security. And she also uses this term in-source jobs. So we hopefully know what outsourcing is, which I very briefly mentioned when we were talking about NAFTA. So outsourcing is picking up a factory and saying, we're not going to do this here anymore. We're going to move to another country where it's cheaper and the labor regulations are lower and it's cheaper to pay workers. So I've mentioned I'm from Michigan, and the auto industry has done a lot of outsourcing. Insourcing is actually what happens when you move within the country, but still for similar reasons, to places where it's cheaper to set up shop, you can pay your employees lower, and again, it's often a union busting move. So one in the kind of history of Lowell, if we want to think about that, the textile factories picked up as their equipment began aging, and not coincidentally, right, when their workers began to organize for more rights and more pay, they picked up and moved those factories south. So they're still in the United States. They still have to follow federal labor law, but they don't have to deal with unions. They're in states that don't have the kind of union-friendly legislation that we had and have here in Massachusetts, and they're able to operate much more cheaply. And then also we see a lot of immigrants working in the service sector. So she talks about landscaping, nannies. Next week, we're going to focus solely on domestic workers, and we're going to have a guest lecturer who's going to give the lecture, and she's going to talk a lot more about this. And then back to our old friend, I know that I've said this a million times this semester, but again, a lot of these sectors classify their workers as independent contractors, which saves them from being able to pay into things like unemployment insurance, keeps the workers from having the kind of rights and benefits that a permanent employee would have. Okay, let's do a really quick rundown of what's changed in the past 3 years during the current administration. So, folks who were doing immigration organizing during the Obama era referred to him as the deporter in chief because deportations picked up quite a bit under his administration, as much as folks thought of him as a very liberal, a kind of post racial president. That was actually we really saw an increase in the amount of deportation activity during that time. Trump has obviously kicked that up a notch, and it's been a cornerstone of his administration to oppose legal and illegal immigration. So, very quick rundown. One, we have an executive order for the border wall to be built. A year ago, there was a government shutdown, and the issue was that Congress was being pressured or forced into providing funding for that wall. And so we saw several months of most federal government operations shut down. Trump has established a new office that tracks crimes done by immigrants, which is a propaganda piece. There are attempted very early in 2017 to have sanctions and punishments against sanctuary cities. These were later overturned by the courts, but we have seen another version of that in the fall. As many of you know, there's a new kind of ID that will be required if you want to fly, even domestically. And Trump has said that New York, which has sanctuary laws in place, will not be eligible for things like expedited entry through the airport lines because of their sanctuary status. That's held up in the courts right now. Obviously, the travel bans are a huge part of this. So no travel from Muslim majority countries, and eventually Venezuela and North Korea are added to that. The first version is overturned by the courts. The second version was couched in terms that said this isn't a Muslim ban, it just happens to be these countries that are Muslim majority, and it has been allowed to stand. DAPA and DACA were rescinded. That's been overturned and is still in flux right now. The zero tolerance policy. So separating families at the border, putting them in immigrant detention centers with horrible conditions, tent cities. Hopefully you all saw news reports of what that looked like and how horrific that was. Allegedly, the administration has said that the policy is no longer to separate families. Reporters say otherwise. We know that it is continuing at least to some extent, and we have seen an uptick in the number of people who are becoming ill and dying at the border and in these immigration detention centers. That's going to get worse with the coronavirus because anytime that you're having a lot of people in small quarters, a virus is going to run through them. Same with our prison system, actually is going to be strongly impacted by the virus. In 2019, Trump announced that there would be a cap on refugees of 30,000, which is significantly lower than any time in modern American history. Trump has tried to end TPS status for Sudan, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Haiti, Nepal, and Honduras. All of those, I believe, were later extended in the courts. One of the main ways that Trump has been really effective is to remove or not hire in the kind of judges who process immigration cases and not staff the offices who are processing a lot of the paperwork and doing a lot of the background work. I have a friend who is an immigration caseworker for a U.S. senator, and she has said that progress has basically just stopped just by sheer bureaucratic inefficiency by design. Domestic violence is no longer grounds for seeking asylum in the U.S. Deportation is allowed without any kind of due process. And Trump has recently announced that he is seeking to roll back birthright citizenship, i.e., the right to say that you are a U.S. citizen if you're born on U.S. soil. So that is obviously a lot that you all have been watching happen in real time, just as I have. So let's talk about why at least according to the Chomsky reading we've done, why that's a problem. So what's the problem with saying we shouldn't have undocumented workers, leaving aside legal immigrants for the moment? So Chomsky says this is going to backfire for a few reasons. One, our society is already organized around industries that are built to rely on migrant labor. We have seen reports from farm owners who rely on migrants to pick their crops, and they're saying, you know, with the increased security at the border and the increase in detentions, they're actually having crops that are rotting in the fields because there isn't the labor available to pick them. And we are, at least up until coronavirus, we have a certain level of consumption in the United States that is quite a bit higher than most other even developed countries. And so it takes a workforce to supply those needs. Second, Chomsky says that this is a harm not only to communities that, we have immigrants working and living among us, but we also have a lot of small businesses that rely on the business that comes from those immigrants. We collect taxes from many of those immigrants. And she says that these policies are applied unevenly and nonsensically. She gives some examples of, an immigration raid in a plant where someone goes to stand next to his boss. The boss is white looking, and the guy says, "Let me see your driver's license. You're good, you can stay." The obviously Hispanic worker gives his driver's license, and they say, "No, that's not enough. We need more proof that you're here legally." And then, of course, undocumented people, as I said, do contribute to the economy and actually have higher productivity rates than documented people. And that's another example that she gives, that if we eliminate undocumented people, kick them all out tomorrow, we're really going to actually economically be in a lot of trouble. And of course, she also says that there's a moral reason as well. So I wanted to point us to page 128 of Chomsky, which gives a really nice summary. She says, as we in the United States confront the problems in our agricultural and food production system, the problem of labor scarcity, this idea that we don't have enough labor, we rely on this labor to get things done, and continued reliance on impoverished, undocumented workers has to be central to the discussion. Given the way the agricultural system currently works, farm labor is so precarious and so harsh that only displaced migrants, the majority of them rendered illegal by U.S. laws, are willing and able to carry it out. Paradoxically, most of these migrants were in fact displaced from the centuries-old systems of subsistence agriculture in Mexico by precisely the same agricultural modernization that now demands their labor elsewhere. And certainly the Bracero laws play into that. A truly comprehensive approach to immigration reform would look at these interlocking economic and structural systems, not merely make more narrow changes in immigration law. So that is her argument in a nutshell. If you're looking for one place where she lays out exactly what she's thinking, this is it. I want to mention just a couple more things. One, the uptick in workplace rates, and I want to think about this from a labor perspective. Chomsky mentions a number of these. The first is Operation Vanguard in '99, and this is in Nebraska, where the government essentially subpoenaed all of the employment records for anyone who is working in meatpacking in Nebraska, pull out all of the folks that they say we see an irregularity. A lot of folks just flee their jobs and leave. We see the Swift raids in 2006 and 7 under Bush second, where 1,300 meatpackers are arrested. Postville in '08 is a kosher processing plant, and 389 out of the 900 workers were arrested, so almost half of the workforce is arrested, many of them deported. And in 2019, across the state of Mississippi, we also saw 680 workers arrested and most of them deported, also in meatpacking plants. Now, Chomsky talks about the reason why the meatpacking industry is so reliant on undocumented labor in particular. Again, this has to do with insourcing, this idea of moving factories from labor-friendly places with higher prevailing wages to places that have lower prevailing wages and fewer labor laws. And the important thing to know here is that Very rarely do the companies who are employing these folks ever face any kind of meaningful penalties. So if you remember, we talked about IRCA 1986. This is the first time that we see penalties for employing undocumented labor. And what we're actually seeing as we see this play out is that the people who are paying the price, paying the real penalty for the undocumented labor is not the companies that are employing them, but rather the workers themselves and their families, and also the small businesses and their employees. You know, the Postville plant, she says this is a tiny town of like originally 1,400 people, right? If you remove 389 people, that's going to take a real pretty devastating toll on that entire community. So I want to take a minute to talk about the labor movement and its attitudes towards immigration. Up until the year 2000, the AFL-CIO really was strongly in favor of having severe penalties to employ undocumented people and severe penalties as well on the employees themselves. And the rationale for that is that it lowers the working standards for everyone. That has shifted. Since then, the AFL-CIO has been very open and said the problem isn't immigration, it's not status. The problem is really that we need workers to be treated well. And so let's make sure that we turn our critique on the employer and not on the employees. And Chomsky gives a kind of brief summary that I wanted to share of the rationale against sanctions. She says, by making a large group of workers more vulnerable to exploitation because they have little recourse under the law, sanctions enable employers to lower wages and working conditions with little fear that workers will protest or organize. Thus, the sanctions paradoxically make undocumented immigrants a more desirable workforce because the sanctions make them more desperate and more willing to accept substandard working conditions. We also talked about the fact that the AFL-CIO and the labor movement has seen a shift to a kind of model of organizing for the common good and a kind of more socially progressive model in the 21st century, and this definitely plays into that. So part of that has been worker centers, which are not formal unions. We talked about this, and you'll hear about this next week when we talk about domestic workers, but funneling money to those worker centers. So this leads to the prompts. There's two prompts for this week. The first one, I want to think about who should be responsible for goods and services that are produced with problematic labor standards, whether that's low-wage workers. We know that the people who are at the very bottom of the pile are undocumented workers. They're working without safety precautions. They're working often under the table for cash below minimum wage. And I want you to think about in your prompt, who should be responsible? Is it the government? So either the government should do what Trump is doing and really lock down on all kinds of immigration, or the government should open up and create pathways to citizenship and to allow for employment regardless of documentation status. Is it employers? Should they face severe penalties in order to make sure that they are complying with current labor immigration laws? Is it employees? Should we have penalties? What should the penalties be for employees who are seeking work and providing, for example, providing false documents to prove their immigration or citizenship status? Or is it consumers? So should the onus be on us to figure out who are the companies who are bad actors and who who are the companies that are good actors that we should be supporting and saying, we know that these meatpacking plants are using a ton of really problematic labor practices, so we should be using our power to do that. So what's kind of the magic formula, you think, to start to solve some of this problem? And what I'd like you to do this week, as opposed to last week, you just posted once in each thread. This week, what I'd like you to do is write one longer post of about 150 to 200 words. Try to post that by midweek, and then reply to somebody else so that this is more interactive and it's less you all just submitting things to me and more you know, we can't recreate the classroom experience, but we can try to recreate some of that. So I'd like you to actually interact with each other and try to have 2 additional responses to somebody else's post. So that's 3 total. So the second prompt that I'd like you to do is to watch a video of the song Immigrants, We Get the Job Done, which is a kind of remix based on a line from the Lin-Manuel Miranda musical Hamilton that has been kind of remixed, and it's very interesting. I think there's a lot of layers to it, so I'd like you to watch that video and just do a quick reflection on what you notice, what words, what images that ties into what Chomsky is writing about, and there's a lot there. It actually is like a perfect pairing, so I encourage you to be very interactive with that, to reply to each other's posts again, rather than, I'm not going to kind of track how you reply and where you do on this one at least, but I would like you to try to interact with each other. So that is number 2. And then I'm putting up a bonus thread just for fun. So if you were going to have a labor studies playlist on Spotify, what songs would you put in there? And I will share that next week if we have any takers on that. So that's it. I hope that you all stay healthy. If you have any issues or you have questions about the paper, shoot me an email. I will be in those Blackboard Collaborate sessions from 2 to 4 on Wednesday and Friday, and I hope that everyone has a good week. Here is Hilda, who has been sitting next to me like a creeper this whole time. I hope that you're all spending quality time with pets and family and loved ones. Take care.